The plot hound would not leave the floorboard alone. Every morning, before the sun cleared the ridge, he pressed his broad nose against the same warped pine plank and scratched at it with both front paws in long, deliberate strokes. He did this for 20 minutes on the first day. He did it for over an hour on the third. By the 9th morning, his claws had worn pale grooves into the dark grain, and the wood around the plank was scuffed and raw. He was not chasing a rat. He was not digging at a scent left by some animal that had crawled beneath the floor to die. Something held him there with a focus that bordered on obsession, and 20-year-old Hadley Mercer had no idea what it could be. She knelt beside the dog and pressed her ear against the floorboard. The wood was cold from the mountain air that crept through every crack in the building. She could hear nothing beneath it except silence. But the dog kept scratching, and the dog had never been wrong about anything since the day she found him standing in the median of a Kentucky highway with traffic roaring past on both sides. She trusted him more than she trusted any person alive. That trust was about to pull both of them beneath that floor and into a dead woman's secret that had been sealed in stone for over 6 decades. And when the people who believed that secret belonged to them came to take it back, the only thing standing between Hadley and losing everything would be a brindle hound who had already decided he would never leave her side. Hadley had owned the building for exactly 12 days. It was a former apothecary in Paintsville, Kentucky, a small town pressed between the Lavisa Fork of the Big Sandy River and the low green mountains of Johnson County. The building sat on a narrow lot at the end of a gravel lane behind the old railroad depot. It was roughly 25 feet by 35 feet, with clapboard siding painted a sage green that had faded and peeled down to bare wood in patches. The roof was tin, and it leaked in 3 places when the rain came from the west. The front door hung on one hinge, and the back door was missing entirely. Dried herb bundles still dangled from rusted hooks beneath the front eave, like the fingers of something that had died reaching for sunlight. The interior smelled like dried lavender and mouse droppings, and a century of mountain damp that had soaked into every board and beam. A long wooden counter ran the length of the east wall, with rows of empty glass apothecary jars on shelves behind it. Most of the jars were cracked or clouded with age, but a few still held dried remnants of herbs that crumbled to powder when touched. This building cost Hadley $10 at a Johnson County tax sale. She found the listing while scrolling on a borrowed phone at a laundromat in Prestonsburg. The auction closed in 4 hours, and nobody else had placed a bid. She typed in her debit card number and won the property before her laundry finished drying. She moved in 2 days later with a foam pad from a Goodwill and a duffel bag holding every item she owned in the world. The dog came first. She found him 5 weeks before the apothecary, standing in the median of Route 23 south of Pikeville, with traffic roaring past on both sides. He was brindle-coated and broad-chested, with a notched left ear, where something had torn clean through the cartilage. His ribs showed through his coat like the hull of a boat pressing through canvas. He stood in the median, staring at her Honda as it passed, and something in the way he held his ground made her pull over a quarter-mile down the road and walk back along the gravel shoulder with her heart knocking against her chest. He did not run. He did not flinch. He stood there on that thin strip of grass between two lanes of 50-mile-per-hour traffic and watched her approach as though he had been expecting her for a long time. When she crouched and held out her hand, he pressed his forehead against her palm and exhaled. The breath was warm and steady, and it carried the smell of dust and hunger and something she could not name. Something that felt like recognition. She loaded him into the back seat and drove to the nearest gas station for water and a can of Vienna sausages from the shelf beside the register. He ate without gulping and drank without desperation. There was dignity in the way he consumed what she offered, as though he understood that survival did not require the abandonment of composure. He climbed into the front seat afterward and laid his head on her thigh, and that was how they became a pair. She named him Beckett. She had read about Samuel Beckett once in a paperback she found in a shelter donation bin. The writer who kept going when there was no reason to keep going. The name fit the dog the same way a river fits its bed. Not because someone carved it, but because it was always going to end up there. Hadley left home at 17. Home was a rented duplex in Louisa, Kentucky, where her mother's boyfriend broke things when he drank, and he drank every night of the week. He broke dishes and chairs, and once the passenger window of her mother's car with his bare fist while Hadley sat in the back seat, pretending to sleep. He never hit Hadley directly, but the threat lived in every room, like a smell that would not wash out. It was in his eyes when she moved too fast across his line of sight. It was in the way his voice dropped to a whisper before it exploded. It was in the silence that followed the breaking, the terrible calm that settled over the duplex like ash after a fire. Her mother chose him over safety every single time. She chose him over sleep and over peace and over her own daughters. She chose him with her silence and her turned back and her careful arrangement of excuses that stacked higher every month like cordwood against a wall. He is trying. He did not mean it. You do not understand what he has been through. Hadley understood exactly what he had been through because she had been through the same rooms at the same hours, listening to the same glass shatter on the same linoleum floor. She packed a backpack one night while both of them slept and walked 4 miles to the Greyhound station in the dark. She was 17 years old, and she had $83 and a bus ticket to Lexington, and no plan beyond getting far enough away that the sound of breaking glass could not reach her. Lexington did not save her. She worked at a fast food restaurant for 5 months, then a warehouse where she loaded shipping pallets until her shoulders burned. then a cleaning company that paid cash under the table and docked her wages if she missed a single baseboard. She slept in a shelter for 2 months, then a shared apartment with 4 strangers who screamed at each other about dishes and rent and bathroom time. Then in her Honda Civic after the apartment fell apart over money that nobody had and everybody owed. She drifted east back toward the mountains because the mountains were the only geography that felt like hers. Not the towns or the people, but the ridges themselves. The way they held the morning fog in their hollows like cupped hands holding water. The way the light changed from green to gold to blue as the day turned over the peaks. She had no language for why the mountains felt like home when home had never felt safe. But her body knew the difference between flat land and high ground, and it chose high ground every time. She had one older sister named Sable who still lived in Louisa and who had made her peace with the boyfriend by learning to stay quiet and small. Sable worked at a title company and wore pressed blouses and spoke in the careful, measured tone of someone who had trained herself never to raise her voice. She answered the phone with a smile you could hear through the receiver, and she never stayed late at a gathering, and she never laughed louder than the loudest man in the room. She and Hadley had not spoken in over 2 years. The silence between them was not anger exactly, but something heavier. It was the weight of 2 people who survived the same house by choosing opposite doors. Hadley ran. Sable folded. Neither one could look at the other without seeing the choice she did not make. On the 9th morning of Beckett's scratching, Hadley decided to pull the floorboard up. She had tried everything else. She had moved his bed to a different corner. She had laid a blanket over the plank. She had knelt beside him and said his name in the firm, clear tone that usually broke his attention from whatever held it. None of it worked. He returned to the same plank every morning before dawn and scratched at it with the patient, relentless focus of something that would not be redirected. She wedged a flathead screwdriver beneath the plank and pried it loose from the joists. The nails came up screaming from the old wood, with a sound that echoed off the bare walls and startled a sparrow from the rafters. Beneath the plank was a second layer of boards running perpendicular to the first. Between the 2 layers was a gap roughly 6 inches deep, filled with loose rubble and dried moss nests and the papery husks of dead insects. A thick layer of dust rose in a gray cloud when the air hit it, and the smell that came up was old, not rotten or foul, just old in a way that meant no one had disturbed this space in a very long time. Beckett shoved his nose into the gap and snorted and sneezed, and then began pawing at the lower boards with renewed intensity. His claws raked the wood in fast, rhythmic strokes, and his whole body trembled with the effort of getting closer to whatever he had been smelling through 6 inches of pine and rubble for 9 straight days. Hadley pulled 3 more planks free and exposed a section of the lower floor roughly 4 feet square. In the center of that section was a hinged panel cut into the boards with iron strap hinges that had gone black with oxidation. The hinges were hand-forged. The screws that held them were square-headed and seated deep in the wood. Someone had built this panel to be opened and closed, and someone else had built a floor on top of it to make sure it was never opened again. A trap door. She pried it open, and a rush of cool air rose from below, carrying the smell of damp earth and dried herbs and something mineral and ancient. Stone that had been underground for longer than anyone in this town had been alive. A place that had been waiting. Stone steps descended into darkness. Beckett went down those steps before Hadley could reach for a flashlight. She heard his claws clicking on stone in the dark, below each click, precise and deliberate, like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something she could not yet see. She grabbed the flashlight from her duffel bag and followed him down. The steps were hand-cut limestone, 8 of them, each worn smooth in the center from decades of foot traffic. They led into a root cellar, roughly 12 feet by 15 feet, with a vaulted stone ceiling and walls lined with wooden shelving from floor to arch. The air was cool and constant, maybe 55 degrees, the kind of temperature that preserves. The shelves were not empty. They held hundreds of glass apothecary jars arranged in neat rows, each jar sealed with a cork or glass stopper and labeled in careful handwriting on strips of linen tape. The handwriting was small and meticulous, the kind that comes from a steady hand and a disciplined mind. Hadley moved the flashlight beam slowly across the labels, and the names read like a catalog of the mountain pharmacopoeia: golden seal, ginseng, black cohosh, sassafras bark, slippery elm, bloodroot, boneset, spice bush, witch hazel, yellow dock, pokeweed tincture, wild cherry bark syrup, comfrey root, blue cohosh, yarrow, white oak bark, mullein leaf, elderberry. Each jar still held its contents, preserved by the cool, constant temperature and the airtight seals. The colors ranged from amber to deep brown to pale green to a red so dark it was almost black. Some held dried leaves pressed flat like pages in a book. Others held roots twisted into shapes that resembled small animals frozen in mid-stride. Others held liquids that caught the flashlight beam and glowed like lanterns filled with autumn. Hadley counted. She moved the beam from shelf to shelf and counted every jar she could see. She stopped at 214, and there were still 3 shelves she had not reached. On a workbench against the far wall, there sat a leather-bound ledger with a name written in faded ink on the cover. Eloise Crow. The letters were formed with the same careful hand that had labeled every jar on every shelf. Beside the ledger was a set of brass apothecary scales with weights still nested in their velvet-lined box. A mortar and pestle, carved from soapstone, sat on the bench next to a stack of cheesecloth squares, folded into precise rectangles. Everything was arranged with the care of someone who expected to return to this bench and continue working. But no one had. Beckett sniffed his way along the base of the shelves with his tail held high and steady. His nose swept the floor in wide arcs, reading the stone the way a scholar reads a manuscript. He paused at the far corner of the room and pawed at a loose stone in the floor. One paw, then two. The same deliberate scratching he had done on the floorboard above. Hadley knelt and worked the stone free with the screwdriver. Beneath it was a tin box the size of a cigar case sealed with wax around the seam. The wax was old and brittle, and it cracked away in flakes when she pressed the screwdriver beneath the lid. She broke the seal and opened the box. Inside were 14 tightly rolled bills held together with a strip of cotton string. The bills were old. The paper was soft with age, and the ink had faded to a pale green on the smaller denominations. The largest was a $100 note from 1928 with a gold certificate seal. The others were 20s and 10s from the 1930s and 1940s. She counted them twice. The total was $640 in face value. She held the $100 gold certificate up to the flashlight and stared at the paper. It was older than anyone she had ever known. It had survived longer than most buildings in this town. It had been sealed in wax beneath a stone floor, in a cellar beneath a trapdoor, beneath a second floor for over 60 years, and it was still here, still crisp at the edges. She whispered to Beckett without looking away from the bill. Who puts money under a stone floor and leaves it there for 60 years? Beckett's tail brushed the packed earth behind him. He sat beside the loose stone and watched her with patience and certainty, and the quiet understanding that she would figure it out when she was ready. She set the box on the workbench and opened the ledger. The first entry was dated April 3rd, 1924. The handwriting filled every line from margin to margin. There was no wasted space, no decorative flourishes. Every word earned its place on the page. Eloine Crow had operated this apothecary from 1924 until her death in 1961. She was a root doctor, an herb woman, a healer who served the coal camps and farming communities of Johnson County for 37 years. Her ledger recorded every remedy she prepared and every patient she treated. She listed symptoms and treatments and outcomes with the rigor of a trained physician, though she had never attended a day of medical school. She learned her craft from her grandmother, who learned it from hers. The knowledge stretched back through generations of Appalachian women who understood the medicine that grew wild on every mountainside and in every hollow and along every creek bank in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Women who walked the ridges in every season and knew which root to pull in April and which bark to strip in October and which leaf to dry in August when the oils were at their peak. Hadley carried the ledger upstairs and sat on the floor of the apothecary with Beckett beside her. She read for 3 hours straight. The morning light came through the east windows and moved across the floor in slow golden rectangles, and she did not notice it. She did not notice the cold or the hunger or the stiffness in her legs from sitting cross-legged on pine boards. She read the way someone reads a letter from a person they have been waiting to hear from their entire life.
The entries were meticulous.
A child with whooping cough, treated with wild cherry bark syrup and boneset tea. Outcome noted 6 days later. Cough broken. Child recovered. A miner with a crushed hand given a poultice of comfrey root and golden seal, and wrapped in cheesecloth that was changed every 12 hours. A woman in difficult labor eased with blue cohosh tincture, administered in careful measured doses. Burns treated with slippery elm paste. Fevers broken with sassafras and yarrow. Infections drawn out with bloodroot. Coughs loosened with mullein. Pain dulled with white willow bark. Eloine charged what people could pay. Sometimes that was 50 cents. Sometimes it was a quarter. Sometimes it was a chicken, or a bushel of apples, or a jar of honey, or a promise to help mend her fence in spring. She kept a separate column in the ledger for debts forgiven, and it was the longest column on every page. In 37 years of practice, she had forgiven more than she had collected, and she had recorded every forgiven debt with the same precision she used to record every remedy. That afternoon, Hadley went back down the stone steps with the flashlight and searched the cellar floor on her hands and knees. Beckett worked beside her, his nose pressed to the packed earth. Together, they found 3 more tin boxes, hidden beneath loose stones in different corners of the room. The second box held $880. The third held $1,240. The fourth held $520. She stacked the bills carefully on the workbench beside the brass scales and the soapstone mortar. The total cash from all 4 boxes was $3,280 in face value. But the bills themselves were old, and some were rare. She did not know their collector value yet. She knew only that Eloine Crow had hidden money beneath the floor of her own cellar in sealed tin boxes, and that the money had sat there untouched for more than 6 decades. She sat on the bottom step with the flashlight resting on her knee and looked at the workbench. The scales, the mortar, the cheesecloth, the ledger. Everything arranged as though Eloine had stepped away for a moment and would return any minute to weigh another dose of golden seal or grind another root into paste. But she had not returned. She had died in 1961, and no one had come down these steps since. Hadley drove to the veterinary clinic on the west end of Paintsville that same afternoon. She needed Beckett checked. His ribs still showed, and his coat was dull in patches, and the torn ear had healed badly into a thick knot of scar tissue that she worried might be infected. The vet was a woman named Theda Rawlings. She was mid-30s with short copper hair and hands that moved over animals with quiet precision. She examined Beckett's notched ear and ran her fingers along his ribs and looked inside his mouth and checked his joints one by one with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and still cared about doing it right. "Plot hound," she said without looking up. "Purebred or close to it. Maybe a touch of malnutrition in the jaw. The muscle is wasted here. She pressed gently along his lower mandible. Somebody raised him for bear hunting and then cut him loose when he did not perform. That is why the ear is torn. He got into something bigger than him, and instead of finishing the job, the hunter finished with the dog. She gave Beckett a full checkup and 2 vaccinations and a dose of dewormer. She charged Hadley $15 for everything, because she said that was the Paintsville rate for people who clearly needed the break. Hadley pulled a crumpled 20 from her pocket and held it out, but Theda shook her head and pushed the bill back toward her hand. "Keep the change and buy yourself something to eat tonight. You look like you need it more than I do." Beckett licked Theda's wrist, and she scratched him behind his good ear with her thumb. He leaned into her hand and closed his eyes. "There is a man named Orrin Blackwell who runs a dog rescue from his farm up Muddy Branch Road," Theda said, while writing on a prescription pad. "Tell him I sent you. He will have food and supplies for this one." Hadley found Orrin Blackwell that evening at the end of a rutted dirt road that climbed 2 miles into the hills above town. The road was not paved, and it had not been graded in years, and her Honda scraped its undercarriage twice on exposed rock before she reached the top. Orrin's farm sat on 11 acres of hillside pasture, fenced with wire and locust posts. A barn and 3 outbuildings formed a loose square around a mud yard, where dogs moved freely in the last light of the day. Orrin was 63 years old, lean and sunburned, with a white beard trimmed close to his jaw, and overalls that had been patched so many times they looked like a quilt someone had decided to wear instead of spread on a bed. He stood in the barn doorway with a bucket of feed in each hand and watched Hadley pull up and park and get out with Beckett beside her. He looked at the dog for a long time. He set the buckets down and walked over and crouched and placed his hands on either side of Beckett's head and looked him in the eyes. "That is a real hound," he said quietly. "Somebody spent good money on that dog and then threw him away when the dog did not earn it back fast enough. People do that more than you would believe. They buy a dog for what it can do for them, and when it does not do enough, they open the truck door on a back road and drive away. The dog stands there and watches the truck disappear, and then it starts walking." He stood up and looked at Hadley. "Theda told me about your situation." He said it matter-of-factly, without pity or hesitation. He walked to the back of the barn and loaded the back of the Honda with a 50-pound bag of kibble, 2 wool blankets, a water bowl, a rope leash, and a paper sack of cornbread wrapped in waxed paper. "Come back when you need more," he said. "This is not charity. This is mountain people doing what mountain people do." Hadley sat in the Honda for a long time after leaving Orrin's farm. She looked at the supplies piled in the back seat, and then down at Beckett in the passenger seat. The dog rested his chin on the center console and looked up at her with amber eyes that held the last copper light of the evening. "I do not understand these people," she said quietly. "Nobody has ever given me anything without wanting something back." Beckett pressed his nose against her forearm. His breath was warm and slow, and it fogged the skin above her wrist. She drove back to the apothecary and continued reading the ledger by flashlight
while Beckett chewed a piece of cornbread beside her on the foam pad. The building was dark except for the beam of light moving across the pages and the faint glow of stars through the east window where the glass was cracked and missing in 2 panes. Between the medical entries, Eloise had written personal reflections in smaller handwriting pressed into the margins. She wrote about the seasons. Dogwood blooming white along the creek in April, the petals drifting on the water like small boats carrying nothing. Rain on a tin roof in August when the air was so thick with humidity that breathing felt like drinking. Black walnut hulls staining her fingers in October. The first frost turning the goldenrod silver along the fence rows, and the fields going quiet one morning, as though someone had told them it was time. She wrote about loneliness with the calm acceptance of someone who had stopped fighting it. She never married. She had no children. She lived alone in the apothecary with a succession of dogs she never named in the ledger, but whose presence was noted. Paws on the floor in the kitchen at dawn. Warm weight against her feet at night when the fire burned low. The sound of breathing that was not hers filling the rooms of a building that would have been unbearable in silence. The loneliness did not define her, but it ran beneath everything she wrote, like groundwater beneath a field. You could not see it from the road, but it was there in every line she wrote after dark. It was there in the way she counted seasons by what bloomed instead of who visited. It was there in the ledger's final pages, where the medical entries grew shorter and the margin notes grew longer, as though the person doing the healing needed healing herself, and the only remedy she could find was ink on paper. Hadley understood that kind of loneliness. She had carried it from the duplex in Louisa to the shelter in Lexington, to the back seat of the Honda, where she slept with her coat over her face and the doors locked and the engine running for heat until the gas gauge dipped below a quarter tank and she had to choose between warmth and distance. She read one passage aloud to Beckett. November again, and the house is quiet, except for the dog breathing beside the stove. I have not spoken to another person in 4 days. The silence is not empty. It is full of things I have not said to anyone because there is no one to say them to. Hadley closed the ledger and pressed her hand flat against the leather cover. The leather was cool and smooth, and it held the shape of every hand that had ever opened it. She was just like us, she said. Beckett shifted his weight and pressed closer against her side. His brindle coat was warm, and his heartbeat was steady and slow, and she could feel it through her shirt. She opened the ledger again and turned to the last page. The final medical entry was dated March 12th, 1961. Below it, in a different ink darker, written with a hand that pressed harder into the paper than any other entry in the book, Eloise had written something that was not a medical record. Today I nailed the new floor over the trapdoor. Took me all morning, and the boards are not level, but they will hold.
If Vernon finds his way in, everything I built in a lifetime will be gone in a week. He will sell the ginseng. He will dump the jars in the creek. He will take the money and drink it away the same as he did with everything else our family ever had. I have hidden the only things that matter beneath the only floor he will never think to look under, because Vernon never looked beneath the surface of anything in his life.
Hadley read the passage twice, then a third time. The name Vernon appeared nowhere else in the ledger, not in the medical entries, not in the margin notes, not in the debts forgiven column. Whoever Vernon was, Elowaine had kept him out of her professional records entirely. He existed only here on the last page in darker ink, a name attached to a threat so serious that Elowaine had spent her last morning of strength nailing a false floor over the only entrance to the cellar that held her life's work.
Who was Vernon? What had he done? What had he taken? And what would he have done with everything in that cellar if he had found it? Hadley set the ledger on the floor beside her and stared at the dark ceiling of the apothecary. The tin roof ticked in the cold. Somewhere in the walls, a mouse moved through old insulation with a sound like paper being crumpled very slowly. Beckett's breathing was steady beside her. His chin rested on her boot, and his eyes were closed.
She had found a dead woman's cellar full of medicine and money and knowledge. She had found a ledger that recorded 37 years of healing. She had found 4 tin boxes of old bills sealed beneath stone. And now she had found a name that Elowaine feared enough to seal her own legacy in darkness rather than let it fall into his hands.
The building was quiet. The mountains outside were dark. The stars moved slowly above the ridgeline, and the Levisa Fork murmured somewhere below the town like a voice trying to say something from very far away. Hadley slept. She woke at 2 a.m. to Beckett standing at the window. His body was rigid, every muscle drawn tight beneath his brindle coat. His ears were forward and his tail was straight and still as a rod of iron. The fur along his spine stood in a raised line from his shoulders to the base of his tail. A low growl built in his chest. It was not loud. It was a vibration more than a sound, something you feel in the floorboards before you hear it in the air. It was the first time Beckett had ever growled.
Hadley moved to the window and looked out. The gravel lane ran straight for about 200 yards before it curved behind the old railroad depot and disappeared. At the far end of the lane, just before the curve, a vehicle was parked in the shadow of a sweet gum tree. A pickup truck, dark-colored, no headlights, no interior light, just a shape in the darkness with the faint glint of a chrome bumper catching what little moonlight made it through the clouds. It sat there for a long time. Hadley watched it, and Beckett watched it, and neither one moved. The growl continued, low and steady and constant. After maybe 20 minutes, the truck's engine turned over. The headlights stayed off. It pulled away from the curb and rolled slowly down the lane and around the curve and out of sight. The sound of its engine faded into the general silence of a small town at 2 in the morning, and then there was nothing. Beckett stayed at the window for another hour. His growl faded slowly like a tide pulling back from a shore. He finally turned away and walked to the foam pad and lay down beside Hadley and placed his chin on her ankle. But his ears did not flatten. His eyes did not fully close. He slept the way soldiers sleep. Ready. The next morning, Hadley opened the front door to let in the light and found a folded piece of paper wedged beneath the threshold. The paper was plain white, unlined. The words were written in blue ballpoint in a hand that was not careful or precise. The handwriting of someone who wrote fast and pressed hard. That building contains property belonging to the Crow family. Return what is not yours. There was no signature, no return address, no name, just the message and the paper and the faint blue ink that bled at the edges where the pen had paused too long. Hadley read it twice. She folded it and put it in her pocket and stood in the doorway and looked down the gravel lane toward where the truck had been parked in the dark. Beckett stood beside her. He was not growling now, but his head was high and his ears were forward, and his nostrils worked the morning air in quick, shallow pulses. He was reading the lane the same way he had read the floorboard, with patience and focus and the absolute certainty that something was there. Then he turned and walked back into the apothecary and down the stone steps into the cellar. Hadley followed him with the flashlight. He moved past the shelves of jars and past the workbench and past the corner where the tin boxes had been hidden. He walked to the back wall of the cellar, where a wooden partition made of rough-hewn planks divided the main room from whatever lay behind it. Hadley had noticed the partition on her first visit, but had assumed it was structural, a support wall, something the builder had put there to hold the stone arch above. Beckett pressed his nose against the base of the partition and scratched at the wood. One paw, then two. The same deliberate certainty that had led him to the floorboard and the trapdoor and the tin box, and now here, to this wall that was not a wall, to this barrier that someone had placed between the room she had already found and the room she had not. There was a crack in the partition she had not noticed before, a vertical line where two planks did not quite meet, narrow enough to miss, wide enough for air to pass through. And if air could pass through it, then scent could pass through it. And if scent could pass through it, then Beckett already knew what was on the other side. Hadley knelt beside him and pressed her eye to the crack. The flashlight beam went through the gap and lit a narrow slice of the space beyond. She could see stone floor. She could see the curve of something round and dark sitting on the floor. She could see dust in the air, catching the light. She thought about the note in her pocket. She thought about the truck in the dark. She thought about a woman named Eloise who nailed a floor over a trap door. because someone named Vernon could not be trusted with what was underneath. And she thought about the fact that someone in this town already knew what was down here. Someone who believed it belonged to them. Someone who had parked outside her building in the dark and left a threat beneath her door. Whatever was behind that wall had been hidden on purpose by a woman who feared what would happen if the wrong person found it. And now the wrong person was circling. Hadley stood up and brushed the dust from her knees and looked at the partition. She was going to have to open it, but not tonight. Tonight, she was going to go upstairs and lock the door and sleep with Beckett beside her and the screwdriver within reach. Tonight, she was going to lie in the dark and think about what Eloise wrote on the last page of the ledger. If Vernon finds his way in, everything I built in a lifetime will be gone in a week. Hadley pressed her hand flat against the wooden partition. The wood was cold and rough, and it hummed faintly beneath her palm with the vibration of the earth that held it in place. "I will not let that happen," she said to the dark room and the shelves and the ledger on the workbench and the woman who had been dead for more than 60 years. Beckett pressed his shoulder against her leg. His weight was warm and solid, and it said what it always said. "I am here. I am not leaving, and I already know what is on the other side. If you are still here, you already know this story is not just about what was hidden beneath that cellar floor. It is about what happens when the only creature you trust leads you somewhere you were always meant to go. Stay with us, because what Hadley found behind that wall changed everything, and what came after it nearly took it all away." She opened the partition the next morning with the flathead screwdriver and a claw hammer she had found in a rusted toolbox beneath the counter upstairs. The planks were rough-hewn oak, old and dry, and hard as iron. They had been nailed to a frame of 2x4 lumber, with square-headed nails driven deep at close intervals. Whoever built this wall had not been building a shelf support or a structural brace. They had been building a barrier. Something meant to keep people out. The first plank came free with a sound like a branch breaking in winter. The second was easier. By the third, she had established a rhythm, and the work went faster. Beckett sat at the base of the stone steps and watched her with his ears forward and his tail moving in slow, measured sweeps across the packed earth floor. He knew what was coming. He had known for days. When she pulled the fifth plank free, the gap was wide enough to step through. She held the flashlight in front of her and leaned in. The space beyond the partition was smaller than the main cellar. Maybe 6 feet by 6 feet. The stone walls were rougher here, less finished, as though whoever dug this room had done it quickly or in secret. The ceiling was lower too. Hadley had to duck her head to keep from scraping the stone above. On the floor of the chamber, arranged in 3 neat rows, were 34 ceramic crocks. Each crock was roughly the size of a 2-gallon bucket, wide at the base and narrow at the mouth, glazed in a dark brown that had dulled with age. Every mouth was sealed with a thick layer of beeswax that had hardened to the color of old bone. And every crock was labeled in the same handwriting that had labeled every jar on the shelves in the main cellar. But these labels did not list herbs. They listed names: Greasy Creek, Jenny's Creek, Buffalo Mountain, Pigeon Roost, Open Fork, Wolf Pen Branch, Laurel Fork, Little Paint. Each name a specific location deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Places that did not appear on most maps. Places known only to the people who walked those ridges on foot, season after season, year after year, following trails that were not trails, but memory paths worn into the forest floor by generations of feet that knew where to go without being told. Hadley knelt on the stone floor and broke the wax seal on the crock labeled Greasy Creek. The wax cracked cleanly and the seal separated from the rim with a sound like a whisper. She lifted the lid and looked inside. Dried ginseng root, packed tight in layers separated by sheets of cheesecloth. The roots were gnarled and twisted and pale, each one shaped by years of slow growth beneath the canopy of old hardwood forests on north-facing mountain slopes. Some were as long as her hand. Some were small and forked like the legs of a creature caught mid-stride. All of them were perfectly preserved. No mold, no insect damage, no moisture. The beeswax seals had kept the air out completely, and the cool, constant temperature of the cellar had done the rest. Wild ginseng. The kind that grows only in the deep shade of old-growth forest. The kind that takes 7 to 10 years to reach maturity. The kind that cannot be rushed or cultivated or faked because the shape of the root tells the story of its growth, and a buyer who knows what to look for can tell the difference between wild harvested and cultivated in less than a second. The kind that was worth more per pound than almost anything else that grew from the ground in the mountains of Appalachia. Eloise Crow had been collecting wild ginseng for decades. She had harvested it from the mountains and hollows she knew by name, dried it with a method that preserved it perfectly, sealed it in ceramic crocks with beeswax, and stored it in a hidden chamber behind a wooden partition in a root cellar beneath a trapdoor, beneath a false floor, in a building that she owned and operated for 37 years. She had built a vault inside a vault inside a vault, and Beckett had scratched his way through every layer. Hadley opened 2 more crocks, Buffalo Mountain and Pigeon Roost. Both held the same carefully packed ginseng root. She counted all 34 crocks and estimated the weight in her head. Each crock held maybe 2 pounds. Some held more. The total was somewhere around 60 pounds of dried wild ginseng that had been sealed underground since at least 1961. She did not know what it was worth. She knew it was worth something because she had heard men in gas stations and feed stores talk about ginseng prices the way men in cities talked about stock prices.
She knew the wild stuff commanded more than the farmed. She knew old stock was worth more than new, but she did not know the numbers. She needed someone who did. She brought a sample to Theta at the vet clinic because Theta was the only person in Paintsville she trusted enough to show it to. Theta held the gnarled root up to the light and turned it slowly between her fingers. Her copper hair caught the fluorescent light above the exam table, and her eyes narrowed. "This is wild ginseng," she said. "Old stock, properly dried. I am not an expert, but I know enough to tell you that this is not something you show to just anyone." She set the root on the exam table and looked at Hadley. "You need to talk to someone who deals in Appalachian botanicals, someone who knows the market and the buyers." She pulled a prescription pad from her coat pocket and wrote a name and phone number on the top sheet. "Lenora Firth, herbal broker, works out of Ashland. She has been buying and selling roots and herbs from these mountains for almost 30 years. If anyone can tell you what you have, it is her." Lenora Firth drove down from Ashland 2 days later in a mud-splattered pickup truck with a toolbox bolted to the bed and a canvas tarp over whatever she was hauling in back. She was 52 years old, broad-shouldered, with thick gray streaked black hair, pulled back in a ponytail, and hands that told the story of a life spent outdoors in every season. Her knuckles were thick. Her nails were cut short. The skin on her palms was calloused in the places where it meets a shovel handle or a digging fork, or the rough bark of a ginseng root pulled fresh from mountain soil. She had been buying and selling Appalachian botanicals for 28 years. She knew every hollow in 5 counties where ginseng grew. She knew every digger and every buyer and every broker between Ashland and Lexington. She could tell the difference between cultivated ginseng and wild harvested root by touch alone, and she could date a dried root to within a decade by the color of its skin and the pattern of its growth rings. She knelt on the cellar floor and opened 3 crocks, while Beckett watched her from the bottom of the stone steps, with his ears forward and his body still. He did not growl at Lenora. He watched her with attention, but without alarm. Lenora weighed samples on the brass scales that Eloise had left on the workbench. The scales still balanced. The weights still read true. She examined roots under a magnifying glass she pulled from her shirt pocket and held each one up to the flashlight beam and turned it slowly the way a jeweler turns a stone. She smelled the dried leaves and rubbed them between her fingers with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. "This is extraordinary," she said quietly. Her voice had the low, steady register of someone who did not waste words on exaggeration. Wild ginseng this old and this well preserved is extremely rare. The drying method was perfect. The roots were dried whole at a low, consistent temperature, probably on racks in this cellar where the air stayed cool and the humidity stayed low. Then sealed in beeswax while the moisture content was at its lowest point. No mold, no insect damage, no oxidation. The seals kept everything out. She sat back on her heels and looked at Hadley. I would estimate these 34 crocks hold roughly 60 pounds of dried wild ginseng. At current market prices, depending on grade and buyer, this collection is worth between $40,000 and $55,000. The oldest batches from the 1920s and 1930s could command a premium from collectors of historical botanicals. There are people who buy ginseng the way other people buy vintage wine. Age and provenance matter.
But that is not all you have, she said. She stood and walked along the shelves in the main cellar, running her finger across the labels of the 247 jars. This is a living catalog of Appalachian folk medicine, spanning nearly 4 decades. These are not just dried herbs. This is a record of practice, a record of knowledge. Universities and botanical archives would pay substantial sums for access to study this collection. The Smithsonian, Appalachian State, the Lloyd Library in Cincinnati. She turned and looked at the ledger on the workbench. And that ledger is a primary source document, a first-person account of Appalachian healing traditions recorded by a practitioner over 37 years. It is priceless, not in the way people use that word casually. I mean, there is no price that would be adequate for what that book represents. Hadley stood in the cellar with the flashlight and listened to Lenora and felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the stone floor. She had been sleeping on a foam pad in a building with no heat and eating canned soup heated on a camp stove and checking her bank balance every morning to see if the $47 she had left would last until she figured out what to do next. And now, a woman she had met an hour ago was telling her that the cellar beneath her feet held a collection worth more than Hadley had earned in the 3 years since she left home. She asked Lenora to keep this quiet. Lenora nodded. I understand. Word travels fast in small towns, and not everyone who hears it will be happy for you. Be careful who you tell. But word did travel. In a town like Paintsville, where the post office and the diner and the hardware store formed a circuit that every piece of news traveled at least twice a day, word always traveled. The veterinarian mentioned it to someone, or the pharmacist who saw Hadley leaving Theta's office with a paper bag, or the woman at the bank who processed Hadley's small deposits and noticed the address on the account. It did not matter who said what to whom. Within a week, people in Paintsville knew that the girl who bought the old apothecary for $10 had found something underneath it. He came on a Thursday morning. Hadley was sitting on the front step sorting through a box of canning jars that Orrin had dropped off the day before when a dark blue pickup truck pulled to the end of the gravel lane and stopped. The same truck. She recognized the chrome bumper and the shape of the cab and the way it sat low on its suspension. A man got out. He was 68 years old, tall and heavy through the middle, with white hair combed straight back from a high forehead, and a face that had been weathered by decades of sun and wind into something that looked carved from wood. He wore a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt and work boots that were muddy at the soles
but clean at the laces as though he had put them on specifically for this visit, and walked through mud on the way. He walked up the gravel lane with a slow, deliberate stride that said he had been here before. Not recently, not in years, but before. He knew the shape of this building and the lay of the lot and the way the lane curved behind the depot. He had been here when the clapboard was still green and the woman inside was still alive. Beckett stood up from the step where he had been lying beside Hadley. His body went rigid. The fur along his spine rose in a line from his shoulders to his tail. The growl came back, louder than it had been at the window, a sound that filled the space between the building and the lane, and said in a language older than words that someone was not welcome here. The man stopped 10 feet from the step. He looked at the dog and then at Hadley. "My name is Prentice Wardlow. I am the grandson of Vernon Crow." The name hit Hadley like a hand against the back of her head. Vernon. The name from the last page of the ledger. The name Eloise had written in darker ink. The name she feared enough to nail a false floor over a trap door. Hadley said nothing. She kept her hand on Beckett's head. The growl continued. Prentice reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper yellowed with age. He held it up so she could see it. "I have a letter," he said, "written by my great-aunt, Eloise Crow. It states that the contents of this building and everything stored within it belong to the Crow family upon her death. My grandfather Vernon was her brother. The property was meant to pass to his line." He took a step closer, and Beckett's growl rose in pitch. Prentice stopped. "I also have family photographs, census records, church records. My family's connection to this building is documented going back to 1924. He folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. "I am not here to take anything by force. I am here to inform you that I intend to pursue my family's legal claim through the proper channels. You purchased a building at a tax auction. You did not purchase a family's heritage." Hadley stood up. She was 5'6" and she weighed 120 pounds, and she was standing in front of a man who was 6'1" and outweighed her by 80 pounds. But she had spent 3 years learning how to stand in front of people who were bigger than her and not give ground. She had learned it in shelters and warehouses and shared apartments and parking lots where she slept in her car. She had learned it from the duplex where surviving meant holding still through the storm and then getting up and moving forward. "Nothing in this building or beneath it belongs to you," she said. "I purchased this property at a legal tax auction. The deed is recorded in my name at the Johnson County Courthouse. If you have a claim, file it with the court. Until then, do not come back to this property." Prentice looked at her for a long time. His eyes were pale blue, and they held the flat, steady light of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through patience and pressure rather than force. He was not angry. He was calibrated. He had come here to measure her, and he was measuring her now. "I will let the court decide," he said. He turned and walked back down the lane to his truck.
He did not hurry. He opened the door and got in and started the engine and pulled away. The truck disappeared around the curve, and the sound of it faded, and the lane was quiet again. Beckett's growl faded slowly. His fur settled, but his eyes stayed on the curve in the lane for a long time. Hadley called the legal aid office in Prestonsburg that afternoon. A lawyer named Merritt Aldine took her call. He was 40 years old, bearded, plain-spoken, and he asked precise questions in a voice that wasted no words. He agreed to take her case pro bono after she described the situation and the deed and the auction records. He drove to Paintsville the next day and sat at the counter of the apothecary and reviewed every document Hadley had. The deed, the auction receipt, the tax records, the ledger, the note that had been left under her door. He read the last page of the ledger where Eloise wrote about Vernon, and he read it twice and then set it down and folded his hands. "The deed is clean," he said. "You purchased the building and the land and everything attached to it at a lawful tax sale. Under Kentucky property law, the contents of a structure transfer with the structure unless specifically excluded in the deed. They were not excluded. The contents are yours." "What about the letter he claims to have from Eloise?" Hadley asked. Aldine rubbed his jaw. "That is where it gets more complicated. If the letter is authentic, and if it constitutes a valid expression of testamentary intent, it could create a basis for a claim. Not a strong one. Not one I think would survive a motion to dismiss, but enough to tie you up in court for months and cost you money you probably do not have." He looked at her directly. "Do you have money for a legal fight?" "No." "Then we need to make sure we do not need one. I need to see that letter, and I need to find out everything I can about Prentice Wardlow and his connection to this property." 2 weeks passed. The lawsuit had not yet been filed, but the threat of it hung over the apothecary like a storm that has not broken. Hadley continued restoring the building. She patched holes in the clapboard with scrap wood. She swept the cellar and cataloged every jar on every shelf, writing each label in a notebook Orrin brought her from town. She read the ledger every evening. She studied Eloine's remedies with the concentration of a student preparing for a test that determines everything. Orrin came twice a week with tools and lumber. He did not ask about the lawsuit or the money or the man who had come to the door. He asked about the roof and the plumbing and the wiring and whether the stovepipe was drawing properly. He was the kind of man who understood that the best way to help someone carry a weight was to stand beside them and work on something concrete while the weight sorted itself out. Theda brought supplies for Beckett and a space heater when the first real cold front came down from the north. She plugged it in and set it beside the foam pad and said nothing about it. She stayed for an hour and helped sand the counter with a piece of sandpaper she had brought from home. Then Sable came. She drove down from Louisa on a Tuesday afternoon in a white sedan that she had washed before the trip. Hadley saw the car from the apothecary window and recognized it before it reached the end of the lane. She recognized the way her sister drove. Careful, both hands on the wheel, 10 and 2. the posture of someone who controlled every variable she could reach, because the variables she could not reach had taught her that control was the only thing between her and chaos. There was a man in the passenger seat. He wore a charcoal blazer and he carried a leather briefcase, and he got out of the car with the practiced ease of someone who got out of cars at buildings with problems inside them for a living. Beckett stood beside Hadley at the window, his shoulder pressed against her thigh. The growl came back, low and steady. Sable knocked on the door and Hadley opened it. Her sister looked polished and composed. Her blouse was pressed. Her hair was smoothed into a low knot at the base of her neck. She wore small gold earrings, and her makeup was precise, and her smile was the controlled expression of someone who had learned to keep her face arranged no matter what was happening behind it. "I heard you bought a building down here," Sable said. Her voice was warm in the way that manufactured warmth is always warm, even and smooth and calibrated to sound like concern. "I wanted to come see it." She glanced at the man beside her. He stepped forward and extended his hand. Hadley did not take it. "My name is Harland Graves," the man said. He did not seem bothered by the refused handshake. "I am an attorney working with a firm in Louisa. Your sister asked me to review some property matters on her behalf." "What property matters?" Graves opened his briefcase on the porch railing. "Your mother has expressed concern about assets discovered on this property. As a family member, she may have standing to petition for a share of any found valuables under Kentucky law." There it was. Mother. Not Sable's idea, not Sable's initiative. Their mother's hand reaching through a 200-mile distance using her older daughter as a glove, the same way she had always used people. The same way she used her boyfriend's violence as a wall between herself and accountability. The same way she used silence as a weapon and absence as a shield. Sable had not come here on her own. She had been sent, and the fact that she allowed herself to be sent told Hadley everything she needed to know about what had changed between them in the 2 years since they last spoke. Nothing had changed. Sable was still quiet, still small, still doing what she was told by whoever was loudest. Hadley felt the old familiar cold settle into her stomach. The same cold she felt every time a door slammed too hard in the duplex. The same cold she carried out of that house at 17 with $83 in her pocket. How did she know Hadley said? Her voice was flat. Sable's smile flickered. Word travels. Someone reached out. A man named Wardlow. So their mother had not found Hadley through maternal instinct or family concern. She had been contacted by Prentice Wardlow, and she had recognized an opportunity. She had connected Sable with Prentice's information and sent her own daughter down the same gravel lane with a lawyer and a briefcase to do what she had always done. Take what she could from the person who could least afford to lose it. "Our mother has not spoken to me since I left," Hadley said. "She does not know this address. She does not know I exist, except when there is something she wants. She just wants what is fair," Sable said.
Hadley looked at her sister and saw the shape of the life Sable had chosen. Stay quiet and stay small. Let the people with louder voices take what they want. Call it fairness. Call it family. Call it anything except what it actually was.
Nothing found on this property belongs to anyone except me. I bought this building at a legal tax auction. The deed is in my name. There is no family claim, and you know that because you work in title insurance. Graves cleared his throat and began to form another sentence. I have a legal aid attorney reviewing my property rights, Hadley said. His name is Merritt Aldine, and he works out of the Prestonsburg office. If you or our mother want to file a claim, file it through the court. Do not come to my door again with a briefcase and a smile and pretend this is about family.
Graves closed the briefcase. The clasp snapped shut with a sound like a small bone breaking.
Sable's smile finally broke, and beneath it was something raw. Not anger, but something closer to envy, dressed up as hurt. The look of someone who had spent her whole life folding herself into a shape that other people approved of, and who could not understand how her younger sister had found the nerve to stand in a doorway and refuse. You always did make everything harder than it needed to be, Sable said quietly. No, Hadley answered. I just stopped making it easier for everyone else. They left. Sable walked to the sedan and got in and closed the door and started the engine. She did not look back. Graves sat in the passenger seat and stared straight ahead. The sedan pulled away down the gravel lane and around the curve, and the sound of it faded, and the lane was empty. Beckett's growl faded. Hadley stood in the doorway with her hand on his broad, warm skull and breathed until the cold in her stomach thawed. It took a long time, longer than it should have, because the cold that came from family was always colder than the cold that came from strangers. 3 days later, Prentice Wardlow filed a formal petition with the Johnson County Circuit Court. The petition claimed ownership of all contents found within the cellar of the apothecary building, based on a letter he alleged was written by Eloise Crow, expressing her intention that the contents pass to the Crow family. The petition named Hadley as the respondent and requested an injunction preventing her from selling or removing any items from the property until the claim was resolved. Merritt Aldine received the filing and called Hadley that evening. His voice was calm, but there was a weight in it that had not been there before. He filed, Aldine said, and the letter he is referencing is attached to the petition. I have read it. It is handwritten on paper that appears to be from the correct period. The language is consistent with someone of Eloine's generation and background. I cannot tell you yet whether it is genuine. What does it say? It says that the property and its contents are to remain within the Crow family, and that no outsider should be permitted to claim what generations of Crows built and maintained. Hadley sat on the floor of the apothecary with her back against the counter and Beckett's head on her knee. She stared at the far wall and said nothing for a long time. "Is this going to work?" she asked. I do not think so, Aldine said carefully. The letter does not meet the formal requirements of a will under Kentucky law. It is not witnessed. It is not notarized. It does not reference the specific contents of the cellar. But a judge could interpret it as evidence of intent, and intent matters in equity cases. What concerns me more is the timeline. Litigation takes months. Court costs add up. And while the case is active, you may be restricted from selling any of the collection. Which means I cannot sell the ginseng, not without risking contempt charges. Not until this is resolved. Hadley hung up the phone and sat in the dark for a long time. The flashlight was off. The building was cold. November had come to the mountains, and the air that crept through the cracks in the clapboard carried the smell of dead leaves and wood smoke from other people's chimneys. She had tens of thousands of dollars worth of ginseng in a cellar beneath her feet, and she could not touch it. She had old bills she had not yet had appraised because she did not want to carry them out of the building while Prentice's truck might be watching. She had a legal aid lawyer working for free and a court case filed by a man whose grandfather was the exact person Eloise had spent her last morning alive hiding from. And then the town shifted. It did not happen all at once. It happened in small withdrawals. The woman at the hardware store who had started a tab for Hadley stopped by one morning and said she needed to settle the balance. Her voice was apologetic but firm, and she did not make eye contact. The casseroles stopped appearing on the doorstep. The postmaster returned a package to sender instead of holding it. A man Hadley had never met stopped her outside the grocery store and asked if she was the one who bought the Crow place, and when she said yes, he shook his head and walked away without saying anything else. Prentice had been talking, not loudly, not publicly, but in the way that men of his age and standing talked in small towns. At the diner counter, at the feed store, after church on Sunday when the congregation lingered in the parking lot. He told people that Hadley was an outsider who had bought a building for $10 and was now claiming a family's heritage as her own. He told them that Eloise Crow had been his great-aunt and that the contents of the cellar were meant to stay in the family. He told them that Hadley was a drifter with no roots in the community and no right to what she had found. He did not lie exactly. He told a version of the truth that left out every piece of context that would have changed its meaning. He left out Vernon. He left out the last page of the ledger. He left out the false floor and the sealed trap door and the decades of silence that meant Eloise had not wanted anyone in her family to find what was down there. But Hadley could not tell people what she knew, because the ledger was evidence in a pending case, and Aldine had told her not to discuss the details publicly. So the story Prentice told was the only story the town heard. And in a town where family names carried weight and outsiders carried suspicion, his story was the one that stuck. Hadley felt the isolation close around her, like water rising in a room with no windows. She had been alone before. She had been alone in shelters and in parking lots, and on the highway at 3 a.m, with the gas light on and no money in her account. But this was different. This was being alone in a place that had started to feel like it might become home, and watching that feeling drain away like heat through a cracked wall. Orrin still came. He drove his truck up twice a week and unloaded lumber, and did not mention the lawsuit or the gossip or the cold looks at the hardware store. He worked on the roof, and he worked on the siding, and he talked about dogs and weather and the way chestnut wood splits clean when the grain is straight. He never said the word prentice, and he never said the word Wardlow, and his silence on those subjects was louder than any reassurance he could have offered. Theta still came. She brought a bag of dog food and a bottle of flea treatment, and she sat on the counter and drank coffee from a thermos and told Hadley about a cat that had come into the clinic with a fish hook in its lip, and how she had removed it without sedation because the cat was too old for anesthesia, and had sat perfectly still through the entire procedure, as if it understood that the pain of removal was less than the pain of leaving it in. These two people stayed. Everyone else pulled back, and Hadley understood for the first time what Elowain must have felt in those final years, when the entries in the ledger grew shorter and the margin notes grew longer. The particular loneliness of being needed by a community that does not fully accept you. The exhaustion of earning trust that can be withdrawn by someone else's words. She went back to the ledger. She had read it cover to cover twice already, but now she read it differently. She read the margins. She read the spaces between the medical entries. She read with the focus of someone looking for a specific name in a crowd. She found Vernon, not in the medical records, not in the formal entries, in the margins, in the smaller, cramped handwriting that Elowain used when she was writing for herself, and not for the record. March 1949. Vernon came again. Took 2 crocks of ginseng from the cellar while I was on a sick call at the Daniels place. He knows the value. He does not know the full count. June 1951. Vernon wants me to sell the building to a land dealer from Ashland. Says the lot is worth more as a warehouse site than an apothecary. I said no. He said I would regret it. October 1953. Found the back door forced. Lock broken clean off. Nothing taken that I can see. But the cellar door was open. Vernon knows about the cellar. February 1955. Today I changed the locks. Vernon will not have a key again. He came last Tuesday and demanded money. Said our parents would have wanted him to have half of everything. Our parents wanted him to stop drinking, and he could not manage that either. November 1955. I have not spoken to Vernon in 8 months. He sent a man from town to ask about buying the ginseng. I sent the man away. Vernon will not come himself because he knows I will not open the door. This is the peace I have. It is not much, but it is mine. The entries about Vernon stopped after 1955, 6 years before Elowain died. 6 years of silence between a woman and her brother that ended only when she nailed a new floor over the trapdoor and wrote his name one final time in darker ink on the last page of the book. Hadley closed the ledger and held it against her chest. The leather was warm from her hands. The weight of it was familiar now, like Beckett's head on her knee or the screwdriver in her pocket. It had become part of her inventory, part of the short list of things she carried. She understood now what Prentice's letter was. It was not Eloine's will. It was not Eloine's wish. It was a piece of paper that Vernon had written or obtained or manufactured sometime before Eloine cut him off in 1955. A piece of paper that said what Vernon wanted it to say, and that Prentice had inherited the way children inherit stories. Not because they are true, but because they are the only version of the past that makes the family bearable. But she could not prove it. Not yet. The margin notes were compelling, but they were not legal evidence. They were one woman's account, written in the margins of a medical ledger. A judge might give them weight. A judge might not. She needed more. And that night, Beckett gave it to her. She was sitting on the foam pad, reading by flashlight, when Beckett stood up from his place beside the wood stove and walked to the trapdoor. He descended the stone steps in the dark. She heard his claws on the limestone 8 steps down, and then the soft sound of his paws on the packed earth floor of the cellar. She followed him with the flashlight. He was standing at the workbench. His front paws were up on the edge of the bench, and his nose was pressed against the underside of the bench top, sniffing at the seam where the wooden surface met the frame beneath it. Then he dropped down and began to scratch at the underside of the bench. The same deliberate focus, the same patient, relentless attention that had led her to the floorboard and the trapdoor and the tin boxes and the partition. Every time she thought he had found the last hidden thing, he found another. Hadley crouched and shone the flashlight beneath the bench. The underside of the bench top was smooth planking, but at the center, where the light caught the grain at an angle, she could see a rectangular outline. A panel. Maybe 8 inches by 12. Set flush into the wood and held in place by 2 small brass catches that had gone green with age. She reached under and released the catches. The panel dropped open on a small hinge and something fell into her hand. A wax-sealed envelope. Heavy, stiff with age, and behind it, wedged into the shallow compartment, a second book, smaller than the ledger, bound in dark cloth instead of leather. No name on the cover. She sat on the cellar floor with the envelope in one hand and the book in the other, and Beckett beside her, and the flashlight propped against a crock of ginseng, casting a beam of white light across the stone ceiling. She opened the envelope. The wax broke cleanly. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The handwriting was Eloine's. She recognized it immediately. The same economy of space, but the ink was different, darker, and the hand had pressed harder. Hadley unfolded the letter and read the first line. To whoever finds this cellar. If you are reading this, it means Vernon or his descendants did not find the trapdoor. Good. She read the line again and again, and then she looked at Beckett, who was sitting beside her on the packed earth floor, with his amber eyes catching the flashlight beam and reflecting it back as two steady points of gold. He had found it. He had found everything. The floorboard, the trapdoor, the cellar, the tin boxes, the partition, the crocks, the compartment beneath the workbench. Every hidden thing that Eloise had sealed away from the world this dog had found by pressing his nose against the dark and following the scent of something that no human could smell. Hadley held the letter in both hands. Her fingers trembled, not from cold or fear, from the weight of holding a dead woman's last words and knowing that whatever came next depended on what those words said. She folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. She picked up the small cloth-bound book. She held both against her chest and climbed the stone steps with Beckett ahead of her, his claws clicking on each worn limestone tread. She did not read the rest of the letter that night. She sealed the envelope with tape and placed it and the notebook in the bottom of her duffel bag beneath her one change of clothes and the screwdriver she kept within reach when she slept. She would read it in the morning when the light was good and her hands were steady and her mind was clear enough to understand what a woman who had been dead since 1961 needed her to know. She lay down on the foam pad and Beckett lay beside her and pressed his full weight against her side. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat steadied against her ribs. Outside, the mountains were dark and the stars moved slowly above the ridge line, and somewhere down the gravel lane, a truck may or may not have been parked in the shadow of a sweet gum tree. But inside the apothecary, the air smelled like dried lavender and cedar smoke and the leather of a ledger that had recorded 37 years of a woman's life. And beneath the floor in a cellar lined with stone, 247 jars of mountain medicine sat on their shelves in the dark. 34 crocks of wild ginseng sealed with beeswax. A workbench with a hidden compartment that had held its secret for decades, now hanging open with its brass catches green with age. Everything had been waiting for a very long time, and now the waiting was almost over. If you have stayed with this story this far, you understand something that most people miss. What Hadley found in that cellar was never just ginseng or money. It was knowledge, and knowledge, unlike money, grows when you give it away. What happened next proved that. But first, she had to survive what came for her. She read the letter at dawn. She sat on the floor of the apothecary with her back against the east wall, where the first light came through the cracked window glass, and laid the pages flat across the tops of her thighs. Beckett lay beside her, with his chin on her ankle. The building was cold and still, and the only sound was the tin roof ticking as the morning sun began to warm it from the outside. The letter was 2 pages long, written on both sides. The paper was heavy, something closer to the stock used for legal documents or certificates. Paper meant to last. Paper chosen by someone who understood that what she was writing might not be read for a very long time, and who wanted the words to survive whatever years stood between the writing and the reading. To whoever finds this cellar, if you are reading this, it means Vernon or his descendants did not find the trapdoor. Good. My name is Eloine Crow. I have operated the apothecary above this cellar since April of 1924. I am writing this letter in November of 1960. I am 60 years old. I have been ill for most of this year, and I do not expect to see another spring. The doctor in Paintsville tells me my heart is failing. I told him I already knew that because I have been listening to hearts for 37 years, and I know what a tired one sounds like.
I am writing this letter because I need someone to understand why I sealed this cellar and why I built a floor over the trap door and why I hid everything I spent my life gathering in a room that no one will find unless they are patient enough to look. My brother, Vernon Crow, was born 3 years after me. He was our mother's favorite because he was her only son, and because he learned early how to make people feel sorry for him. He drank from the time he was 15, and he borrowed money he never returned, and he broke promises the way other men break kindling, without effort and without regret. Our parents forgave him every time because forgiving Vernon was easier than confronting him, and because our mother believed that a son's failures were a mother's responsibility to absorb. I built this apothecary with money I earned, selling ginseng and remedies from the time I was 19 years old. Vernon contributed nothing. He did not help build the shelves, or cut the stone steps, or dig the cellar. He did not walk the ridges with me to harvest golden seal or black cohosh. He did not sit with sick children through the night, or mix poultices by lantern light. He did none of the work, and he claimed half the result because he believed that being family entitled him to what other people built. In 1949, he began stealing ginseng from the cellar while I was away on sick calls. He knew the value. He did not know the full count because I kept the oldest stock in a hidden chamber behind a partition that he never found. In 1951, he tried to convince me to sell the building to a land dealer from Ashland. I refused. In 1953, I found my back door forced and the cellar door open. In 1955, I changed the locks and told Vernon he was not welcome in my home again. He sent people. He sent letters. He sent a man who claimed to be a lawyer, but who was really a debt collector Vernon owed money to, and who hoped to settle the debt by convincing me to sign over the building. I sent them all away. In 1955, Vernon wrote a letter to himself and signed my name to it. I know this because I saw a copy of it years later when a man from the county came to ask about property taxes and showed me a document that Vernon had filed with the assessor's office. The letter stated that the building and its contents were to pass to the Crow family upon my death. I did not write that letter. I did not sign it. Vernon wrote it, and he filed it, and he waited for me to die so he could use it.
I am writing this letter so that whoever finds this cellar will know the truth.
Everything beneath this floor belongs to the building and to whoever owns it, not to the Crow family, not to Vernon, not to his children or his children's children. Blood has taken enough from me. I built this alone, and I am leaving it to the building itself and to whoever is patient enough to find it. If you are reading this, you are that person. I do not know who you are. I do not know when you will find this cellar. I know only that you found it, and that means you looked where no one else thought to look. That is enough. That is all I ever asked of anyone. Eloise Crow, November 14th, 1960.
Hadley read the letter 3 times, once quickly and then once slowly, and then a 3rd time with her finger tracing each line. When she finished, she folded the pages and held them against her chest and closed her eyes and breathed. Beckett pressed his nose against her wrist. His breath was warm and slow, and it carried the smell of the cellar and the old wood of the building. Hadley opened the small cloth-bound notebook. It was not a medical ledger. It was a journal, personal, undated in some places and dated in others. Written over what appeared to be many years with variations in ink color and pressure that suggested it had been returned to again and again.
The entries were fragments, thoughts compressed into the smallest possible space, each one complete in itself, and each one connected to the others by the thread of a life lived alone in a building full of remedies for other people's pain.
March.
The first hepatica bloomed on the north slope above Greasy Creek, purple so dark it is almost blue. I dug ginseng there for 2 hours and filled half a sack. The dog sat on the ridge and watched me work. She does not dig, but she knows where I'm going before I do.
August.
A boy came to the door at midnight with his mother behind him. She carried him in her arms, and he was limp and hot, and his breathing sounded like water running over gravel. Croup. I gave him wild cherry bark syrup with honey and steam from a pot of boiling water with eucalyptus leaves. He was breathing clear by morning. She paid me with a jar of pickled beans, and I told her that was more than enough.
January. The coldest night this winter. I sat by the stove until 2 in the morning because the cold would not let me sleep. The dog slept against my feet. I thought about my mother and how she used to say that loneliness was God's way of making room for prayer. I do not pray. I sit with the silence and let it be what it is. The dog breathes and the stove ticks and the wind comes down from the ridge and pushes against the walls. This is my life. It is small and it is quiet and it is mine.
October. 30 years today since I opened the apothecary. I did not mark the occasion. There was no one to mark it with. I walked the ridge above town and collected yellow dock and witch hazel and came home and dried them on the racks in the cellar and labeled the jars and put them on the shelves. The shelves are nearly full.
I have been filling them for 30 years, and they hold everything I know. When I am gone, they will hold everything I was.
Hadley read for an hour. She read about seasons and remedies and patience and dogs. She read about the weight of knowing how to heal people who could not heal themselves, and the heavier weight of not being able to heal your own solitude. She read about a woman who woke before dawn every morning for 37 years and descended 8 stone steps into a cellar and weighed herbs on brass scales and ground roots in a soapstone mortar and mixed tinctures in glass jars and carried them up those same steps and handed them across a counter to people who needed them and who sometimes could not pay and who were always forgiven. She read about a woman who was just like her. That evening, Hadley called Merritt Aldine. She told him about the letter and the notebook. She read him the relevant passages over the phone, while Beckett lay beside the wood stove with his chin on her boot. Aldine was silent for a long time after she finished. "Bring them to me," he said. "Bring the letter and the notebook and the ledger. Bring everything." She drove to Prestonsburg the next morning. Aldine's office was on the second floor of a brick building above a hardware store. The stairs were narrow and the carpet was worn, and the office smelled like coffee and old paper. He sat behind a desk covered in manila folders and read Eloine's letter twice and the notebook entries about Vernon 3 times, and the last page of the ledger where Eloine had written about nailing the floor over the trapdoor. He set the documents down and leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers behind his head and looked at the ceiling for a full minute before he spoke. "The letter Prentice filed with the court," he said. "The one he claims Eloine wrote. Do you understand what it actually is?" "Vernon wrote it," Hadley said. "Eloine says so in her letter." Aldine nodded. "But there is something else. I pulled the original document from the county assessor's records last week. The letter Prentice attached to his petition is not a general statement about the apothecary. It references a specific piece of property." Aldine opened a folder on his desk and pulled out a photocopy. He pointed to a line near the bottom of the handwritten text. "Read this." Hadley leaned forward and read. "The property on Jenny's Creek and all contents therein shall remain within the Crow family." "Jenny's Creek," Aldine said. "Not the apothecary. Jenny's Creek." I searched the Johnson County property records. Eloine Crow owned a small parcel of land on Jenny's Creek that she inherited from her parents, a separate property. 5 acres of unimproved mountain land. Vernon would have known about it because it was family land. The letter references that property. Not this one. He looked at Hadley. Prentice Wardlow took a letter that refers to a 5-acre parcel on Jenny's Creek and presented it to the court as though it referred to the apothecary in Paintsville. He did not alter the letter. He did not forge anything. He simply removed it from its context and placed it in a different one
and hoped that no one would read the specific language closely enough to notice. "Can you prove that in court?" Hadley asked.
"I can prove it with the assessor's records and a surveyor's map and the plain text of the letter itself, combined with Eloine's own letter, which directly states that Vernon forged a document and filed it with the county, combined with the margin notes in the ledger documenting Vernon's theft and harassment over 6 years, combined with the letter's explicit statement that the contents of the cellar belong to the building and its owner, and not to the family." Aldine closed the folder. "This case is over. Prentice either knew the letter referred to Jenny's Creek and filed it anyway, which is fraud, or he genuinely believed it referred to the apothecary because that is the story his father told him. Either way, the letter does not support his claim." The hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in the Johnson County Courthouse. It was a small room with wood paneling and fluorescent lights and a judge named Welford, who wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck and who had been hearing property disputes in Johnson County for 22 years. Prentice sat on one side of the room with an attorney he had hired from Ashland. He wore a pressed shirt, and his white hair was combed, and his hands were folded on the table in front of him. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life believing he was owed something, and who had dressed carefully for the occasion of finally collecting it. Hadley sat on the other side with Aldine. She wore the cleanest clothes she owned, a flannel shirt with a collar that she had ironed on the counter of the apothecary, using a pot of boiling water as a makeshift press. Her hair was pulled back. Her hands were steady. She had learned a long time ago that the only way to survive a room where someone was trying to take something from you was to sit still and speak clearly, and let the truth do the work that panic could not. Aldine presented the documents. He presented the deed and the auction records. He presented the ledger and the margin notes about Vernon. He presented Eloine's letter found beneath the workbench. He presented the assessor's records showing the Jenny's Creek property. He presented the text of Prentice's letter and the specific language that referenced Jenny's Creek and not the apothecary. He did it calmly and methodically. He laid each piece of evidence on the table the way Eloine had laid each jar on each shelf, with precision and care and the quiet confidence of someone who knew that the work spoke for itself. Prentice's attorney objected twice and was overruled both times. The judge read Eloine's letter in its entirety. He read the margin notes. He compared the language of Prentice's letter to the assessor's records for the Jenny's Creek parcel. He removed his glasses and cleaned them on his tie and put them back on, and read the relevant passage one more time. "The petition is denied," Judge Welford said. "The letter presented by the petitioner references a separate and distinct property on Jenny's Creek and does not pertain to the building or its contents at the address in question. Furthermore, the respondent has presented credible evidence that the deceased owner of the property intended its contents to pass with the building to any future owner, and specifically intended to exclude her family from any claim." He looked at Prentice over the tops of his glasses. "Mr. Wardlow, I am not making a finding of fraud today because I do not believe that is what this court needs to do. But I will say that the documents you presented were at best misleading and at worst intentionally deceptive. I suggest you consult with your attorney about the risks of pursuing this matter further." The hearing ended. People stood. Chairs scraped the floor. Prentice's attorney gathered his papers and said something to Prentice in a low voice, and Prentice did not respond. He sat at the table with his hands still folded and stared at the surface of the wood as though he was looking through it to something underneath. Hadley stood and gathered the documents and put them in the folder Aldine had given her. She turned to leave, and Prentice spoke. "My father told me my whole life that Aunt Eloise owed our family. He said she took everything and shared nothing and kept us out of what was rightfully ours. I grew up believing that. I raised my own children believing that. Everything I did here I did because I believed I was collecting a debt that was 60 years overdue." Hadley turned and looked at him. He was 68 years old, and he looked older than that now. The certainty that had carried him up the gravel lane and into the courtroom had drained from his face, and what remained was exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying a story for decades and watching it collapse under the weight of the truth it was built to conceal. She could have said nothing. She could have turned and walked out. But she had read Eloine's journal. She had read about loneliness and silence and the weight of things unsaid. She had spent 3 years carrying her own silences, and she knew what they cost. "You were told a story that was not true," she said. "Your grandfather told it to your father, and your father told it to you, and by the time it reached you, it felt like fact. I understand that, but it was never true, and the woman who built everything in that cellar spent the last 6 years of her life hiding from the family that story created. That was not your fault, but coming here and trying to take what she spent her life protecting. That was your choice." Prentice said nothing. He stood up and put on his canvas jacket and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. His attorney followed him. The door closed behind them and the room was quiet. Aldine put his hand on Hadley's shoulder. "That is done," he said. It was done. The town found out the way small towns find out about everything, not through announcements or newspaper articles, but through the same circuit of counters and parking lots and church steps that had carried Prentice's version of the story in the first place. Only now the story was different. Now it was about a woman named Eloise who had been betrayed by her own brother and who had sealed her life's work in a cellar to protect it. Now it was about a young woman who had found it and fought for it and won. The casseroles came back. A jar of sourwood honey appeared on the apothecary doorstep with no note attached. The woman at the hardware store reopened the tab and told Hadley to pay when she could. The postmaster started holding her mail again. People nodded to her on the street, not with the careful distance of strangers evaluating a newcomer, but with the quiet recognition of a community, acknowledging someone who had earned the right to be there. That night, Hadley went down the stone steps alone.
Beckett followed her to the top of the stairs and lay down with his nose pointed into the cellar. He did not descend. He stayed at the threshold and watched her go down as though he understood that this was something she needed to do by herself. She sat on the workbench where Eloise had weighed herbs and ground roots and mixed tinctures for 37 years. The brass scales sat beside her, their pans level. The soapstone mortar was cool beneath her palm. The shelves rose around her in the dark, each jar a small vessel of knowledge gathered from mountains that had been standing for 300 million years. She spoke to the room, to the shelves and the jars and the stone walls and the packed earth floor, and the woman who had built all of it and sealed it and trusted it to wait. "You hid everything because you knew they would destroy it," she said. "I left home for the same reason. You spent your last morning nailing a floor over the trap door. I spent my last night packing a backpack while everyone slept. You chose the building over your family. I chose the highway over mine. You waited for someone to find this cellar. I do not know what I was waiting for, but I think it was this." Her voice was quiet in the stone room. The words did not echo. They were absorbed by the earth and the jars and the dried herbs and the decades of silence that had held everything in place. "I will not let it sit in the dark anymore," she said. "You gathered all of this so people could be healed. I am going to make sure they are." Beckett shifted at the top of the stairs. His claws clicked once on the limestone. He was not guarding the cellar. He was guarding her. Lenora Firth connected Hadley with a buyer in Lexington who specialized in aged Appalachian botanicals. He drove to Paintsville and spent 4 hours in the cellar examining roots and weighing samples and consulting price charts on his phone. He purchased 20 pounds of the ginseng at $1,550 per pound. The check was for $31,000. The currency dealer Lenora recommended in Ashland appraised the old bills at $8,400. The 1928 gold certificate alone was worth $3,000. The rest were worth various amounts depending on condition and rarity and the particular hunger of collectors who sought paper money from specific decades. Hadley deposited the money in a savings account at the Paintsville National Bank. The teller counted the check twice and looked at her and then looked at the check again and processed the deposit without comment. Hadley did not touch the money for 3 weeks. Every morning she opened the banking app on her phone and stared at the number. She stared at it the way someone stares at a door that has been locked for years and has suddenly opened. She waited for it to disappear. She waited for a phone call from the bank saying there had been a mistake. She waited for the number to change because good things had always been temporary in her life. They had always been followed by something that took them away. But the number stayed. It stayed on Monday, and it stayed on Tuesday, and it stayed through the weekend and into the following week. It sat in the account like a stone at the bottom of a creek, unmoved by current, unmoved by weather, just there. She sat with it. She let it become real, She let it settle into the same part of her mind where she kept the things she trusted. Beckett's weight against her leg, the smell of the cellar, Eloine's handwriting read aloud in the dark. Then she spent it carefully, deliberately, with purpose and without waste. New tin roof panels from a supplier in Ashland who delivered them on a flatbed truck and helped Orrin and Hadley carry them up a ladder that leaned against the building at an angle that made Hadley's stomach drop. A proper wood stove with a chimney that drew clean and hot, and that turned the apothecary from a building you survived the winter in to a building you wanted to spend the winter in. Plumbing, a used refrigerator from a churchyard sale in Salyersville. Wiring inspected and brought up to code by an electrician from Prestonsburg who charged her half his normal rate because Orrin had fixed his truck transmission the year before, and the debt was still outstanding. She built a sleeping loft above the back half of the apothecary, using reclaimed chestnut beams from an old barn that Orrin helped her dismantle on a Saturday morning while Beckett lay in the truck bed and watched them work. The chestnut was old and dark and hard as iron, and it smelled like a century of hay and horse sweat and mountain rain. They carried the beams to the apothecary, and Orrin showed her how to notch them and fit them together without nails. The joints were tight and clean, and the loft was solid enough to hold a bed and a shelf and a reading lamp and a window that looked out over the tin roofs of Paintsville toward the ridge where the sun set every evening in copper and rose. Orrin came twice a week. He taught her how to rehang a door on proper hinges. He showed her how to patch clapboard siding using salvaged wood from his farm. He talked while he worked about dogs he had rescued and dogs he had lost, and the blind mule named Sergeant who stood in his pasture every morning, facing east as though he could see the sunrise through whatever darkness lived behind his eyes. He never asked about the money or the court case or the future. He asked about the roof and the stovepipe and whether the draft was right and whether the counter needed another coat of sanding. Theta came with supplies for Beckett and stayed to help clean the glass jars on the shelves behind the counter. She brought a box of candles when the power went out during a November storm, and sat on the counter and told stories about animals she had treated. A horse that refused to eat until its owner played a specific radio station in the barn. A rooster that followed her to the clinic door every morning for a week and then disappeared, and she never saw it again. She talked about things that mattered in the way ordinary things matter when they are offered freely and without expectation. Hadley kept the remaining 14 crocks of ginseng sealed in the root cellar. She kept the herb collection intact on its shelves. She kept the ledger. She read it every evening by lamplight while Beckett dozed beside the wood stove with his chin resting on her boot. She read it slowly and with attention, and with the understanding that every entry represented a life that had been touched, and a remedy that had been given, and a debt that had been forgiven. She began to learn the remedies Eloine had recorded. She studied the plants and their properties. She hiked the ridges above Paintsville with Beckett at her side, his nose working the forest floor, while she identified plants from descriptions in the ledger. She learned golden seal by its thick yellow root that stained her fingers when she pulled it from the earth.
She learned ginseng by its cluster of red berries in autumn, standing bright against the dark forest floor like small lanterns marking a trail. She learned black cohosh by its tall white flower spikes rising from the shade like candles lit by no one for no reason except that beauty was its own justification. She enrolled in an herbalism certification program through an online college and completed the coursework in the evenings after spending the days restoring the apothecary. She studied at the counter by lamplight with the ledger open beside her textbook and Beckett asleep beneath the stool. She wanted to reopen the apothecary, not as a museum or a curiosity, but as a working practice. A place where the knowledge Eloise had gathered over 37 years could continue to serve the community that had needed it for a century. Lenora introduced her to a network of Appalachian herbalists who had been practicing traditional plant medicine for decades. They welcomed her with the quiet warmth of people who understood that knowledge was meant to be passed forward and not hoarded. A woman named Marin Ashby drove from Moorhead once a month to teach Hadley tincture making in the root cellar, using the same techniques Eloise had recorded in the ledger. They stood at the workbench side by side and measured herbs on the brass scales and ground roots in the soapstone mortar and mixed tinctures in glass jars that Hadley had cleaned and sterilized and relabeled in her own handwriting. A man named Tolliver Gant brought wild harvested seeds from his property near Salyersville and taught Hadley to cultivate ginseng in raised beds on the north-facing slope behind the building. He was 71 years old, and he walked with a limp from a mining injury he had received 40 years ago, and he knew more about the growing habits of wild ginseng than anyone Hadley had ever met. He spoke softly and moved slowly, and he treated the seeds with a reverence that made Hadley understand that what she was planting was not just a crop. It was a continuation. She gave $5,000 to Orrin's rescue. He tried to refuse it, and she told him it was not charity. It was mountain people doing what mountain people do. He looked at her for a long time, and then he nodded and folded the check and put it in the pocket of his overalls and did not mention it again. She gave $2,000 to Theta's clinic. Theta used it to buy a portable X-ray machine that she had been saving for and needed for the large animals she treated on farms outside of town. She set aside $3,000 for a scholarship fund at the community college in Prestonsburg for students aging out of foster care or leaving difficult homes. She wanted the money to go to someone who knew what it felt like to stand in a parking lot with everything they owned in a single bag and no idea where to go next. She told Beckett about the scholarship while she filled out the paperwork at the counter of the apothecary. "Somebody should get a head start that I never got," she said. He thumped his tail against the floor as if he agreed completely. Sable came back on a Saturday afternoon in early December. She came alone. No white sedan, no lawyer, no briefcase. She drove a small gray hatchback that Hadley did not recognize, and she parked at the end of the gravel lane and sat in the car for several minutes before she got out. Hadley watched her from the window. Beckett stood beside her. His body was still. His ears were forward.
but the growl did not come. Sable walked up the lane with her hands in her coat pockets and her shoulders pulled in against the cold. She did not look polished. She did not look composed. She looked like a woman who had driven a long way to say something she was not sure she could say. She stopped at the bottom of the front step and looked up at Hadley standing in the doorway.
"I did not come for money," she said. Her voice was different, quieter, stripped of the warmth that had coated it on her first visit. "I did not come because anyone sent me. Why did you come?" Sable looked at the ground and then at the space above the door where a sign would go, as though she could see something hanging there that had not been built yet.
"When you stood in front of me and that lawyer and told us to leave," she said slowly, "you did not shrink. You did not fold. You did not lower your voice or step backward or apologize. I have never seen anyone in our family do that. I did not know it was possible." She looked at Hadley. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I spent my whole life learning how to make myself small enough to survive that house. I learned how to smile when I was afraid, and how to agree when I was angry, and how to disappear into the background so the loudest person in the room would not notice me. I thought that was strength. I thought that was how you got through. And then I watched my younger sister stand in a doorway and say no to a man with a briefcase, and no to a sister she had not seen in 2 years, and no to a mother who had never once said yes to anything that mattered."
She paused. The wind came down from the ridge and pushed through the bare branches of the sweet gum trees along the lane.
"I am not asking you to forgive me," Sable said. "I know what I did. I know who sent me, and I know I let myself be sent. But I needed to see this." She looked at the apothecary, the patched siding, the new roof panels, the clean glass in the windows. "I needed to see what you built, because I have never built anything. I have only ever tried to keep what was already falling apart from falling apart faster." Hadley stood in the doorway and looked at her sister. She saw the pressed blouse and the low knot and the careful posture. And beneath all of it, she saw the girl who had slept in the room next to hers in the duplex in Louisa. The girl who had listened to the same glass break on the same floor, and who had chosen to stay because staying was the only strategy she knew. She did not forgive Sable. Forgiveness was not something she could hand across a doorstep like a jar of honey. It was something that grew slowly, if it grew at all, like ginseng on a north-facing slope. It took years. It took the right conditions. It could not be rushed. But she did not send her away. She stepped aside and opened the door wider, and Sable came in and stood in the apothecary and looked at the shelves and the counter and the jars and the wood stove and the loft above and the trap door in the floor that led to everything hidden below. Beckett walked over to Sable and stood in front of her. He did not growl. He did not press against Hadley's leg. He extended his nose and sniffed Sable's hand where it hung at her side. He sniffed her wrist
and her fingers and the cuff of her coat. Then he turned and walked back to the wood stove and lay down and put his chin on the floor and closed his eyes. It was not acceptance, not yet, but it was the absence of refusal, and sometimes that was where things began. Hadley turned 21 on a cold December evening. The air was still, and the stars were sharp above the ridge line, and the Lavisa Fork ran dark and quiet through the valley below town. Theda baked a blackberry cobbler from berries she had picked the previous summer and frozen in mason jars. She carried it to the apothecary in a cast-iron pan wrapped in a dish towel and set it on the counter beside the brass scales that Eloise had used for 37 years. Orrin brought a sign. He had carved the word apothecary into a slab of black walnut he had been seasoning in his barn for 2 years. The letters were deep and clean, carved with a chisel and a mallet, and finished with a gouge that gave each letter a slight concavity that caught the light and held it. He had sanded the wood smooth and rubbed it with linseed oil until the grain glowed with the warm, dark luster of something that had been made by hand and made to last. They hung it above the door on iron brackets that Orrin had forged himself. He stood back and folded his arms and looked at it. "That will outlast every one of us," he said with quiet satisfaction. Theda stood beside him and nodded. "It looks like it has always been there." And it did. After everyone left, Hadley stood in the doorway of the apothecary and looked out at the mountains. The Lavisa Fork caught the last silver light of the evening and carried it downstream through the valley like a ribbon of mercury sliding over dark stone. Wood smoke rose from the chimney behind her, and the air tasted like cedar and dried lavender and blackberry cobbler cooling on a counter. The shelves inside held 247 jars of medicine gathered by a woman who had spent her whole life healing people who could not afford to be healed by anyone else. Eloise Crow had lived alone in this building for 37 years. She had no husband. She had no children. She had no one to carry the knowledge she spent a lifetime gathering. She sealed it in a cellar beneath a trapdoor and built a floor over it and trusted the building to keep it safe until someone came along who needed it. It took 63 years. Hadley looked down at Beckett, who sat beside her in the doorway, with his brindle coat catching the last copper light of the evening. His notched ear gave him a lopsided look that she loved. His eyes held the fading sky and reflected it back as 2 small windows into something warm and steady and permanent. "You found all of this," she said to him softly. "You scratched that floor every morning until I paid attention. You found the trapdoor and the tin boxes and the partition and the workbench and the letter. You found everything she hid, everything she was afraid of losing. You found it because you would not stop looking." Beckett leaned his full weight against her leg. His shoulder pressed into her thigh, and his ribs expanded against her knee as he drew a long, slow breath and let it out through his nose. The exhale was warm against her hand where it rested on his broad skull. In the language of hounds, that lean means everything is settled. Everything is where it is supposed to be. The search is over.
The scent has been followed to its source. The thing that was hidden has been found, and the one who found it is resting now beside the one who needed it most.
They say the apothecary still stands in Paintsville with its black walnut sign above the door, and wood smoke rising from its chimney on cold Kentucky mornings. They say that if you drive down the gravel lane behind the old railroad depot, you might see a young woman on the front step sorting dried herbs into glass jars with steady, careful hands. Her fingers know the difference between golden seal and ginseng by touch. Her shelves hold remedies that were old when her grandmother was young. Her ledger sits open on the counter beside a newer notebook where she records her own entries in a handwriting that is learning to be precise. And beside her, on that step, always beside her, a brindled plot hound named Beckett with a notched left ear and eyes that miss nothing. The dog who scratched a floorboard for 9 days because he knew that something was hidden there. The dog who followed a scent through 6 inches of pine and rubble and 6 decades of silence to find a dead woman's legacy sealed in stone. The dog who chose a girl on a highway median and never once reconsidered. He leans against her now, the way he has leaned against her every evening since the day they met. With his full weight, with his whole heart, with the quiet certainty of a creature who found what he was looking for and has no intention of ever letting it go.